Okay, so welcome to the department, the Faculty of Education in Science and Technology. I'm Tali. I'm your host here. I'm also the dean of this small faculty, almost the smallest of the Technion. Ayelet here represents the smallest department, which is the Department of Humanities. Technion is basically a science and engineering higher education institution, and what was then Department of Education in Science and Technology was founded in order to promote science, mathematics, and engineering education years ago, understanding that the leading institution in the field also has to nurture and promote science education in the country. And it began as a teacher education department, and only later it really expanded into research in science education, and then to other fields such as science communication, education in science and engineering in higher education, and so on and so forth. And I don't want to waste any more time, so I give Hanan the honor to open this gathering here.
So Tali, thank you. I'm Hanan Alexander, and it's very exciting for us to be here present for this. It's not exactly the concluding conference of this project, but it's toward the conclusion of our project, in which we're going to begin to share the data that we've collected. This is a project that's been ongoing now for a number of years. A number of you have been involved with us as advisors, as respondents to questionnaires, as interviewees. There are a number of colleagues here that are in an absolutely wonderful research team. We've worked together now for 3 years. And welcome to you all. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. What I want to simply do is say a word or two about the project as a whole, sort of how it got started. I want to remind us of what our research questions were to begin with. Those of you that participated with us in our symposium a year ago, February, we put these research questions up there just to sort of keep ourselves honest and on the table. And then I do want to say a little bit about the structure of Israeli schools, which may not be familiar to some of our guests from abroad, so that we all sort of know what we're talking about. Later on in my response to David, I'm going to say a little bit more theologically about Israeli schools. So the first thing I want to remind us of are the 4 questions with which our project began. This is the project funded by the Templeton World Charities Foundation, part of their Big Questions in Classrooms initiative. There are a number of other very exciting projects in the UK. We were the first international project on this in this effort, and it began as an attempt to try and understand the role of understanding in science education and its relationship to religious education. I'm going to say a little bit more about some of the particulars of this a little bit later, but I want to move on quickly to Michael's introduction. So the first of our questions are, what are the similarities and differences between teaching for knowledge, understanding, and acceptance, as opposed to belief in evolution, as the terms are often used in science education, particularly by Harvey Siegel and Mike Smith, as opposed to teaching in, from, and about worldviews or narratives, as the terms are used in religious education. There, the question is, can we actually take a framework, an educational framework from the context of religious education in order to create the possibility of a dialogue between religion and science? Oftentimes, the basis that we use for those sorts of conversation begins with the epistemology of science. Could we take another sort of epistemological approach and use that as a basis? We don't know the answer to that question yet, and I don't think we're going to answer it today, but that was the first question that we asked. And the second, in what ways have the tensions between scientific and religious beliefs about evolution been addressed, if at all, in Israeli educational policy? About that, we're going to present a fair amount of data today. We've interviewed I would say the vast majority of policymakers for science education and for religious education in Israel. And I'm going to say a little bit about what that term means here, because it means something different in England than it means here in Israel. And so we're all talking on the same terms. But essentially what we want to try and understand is to what extent is this issue an issue? Is it on the table? Are policymakers talking about it? And to what extent has it played a role in curriculum decision-making and development? We're going to present a lot of data about that. The third question, to what extent do Israeli students, teachers, and experts of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian heritage, both secular and religious, accept and understand the scientific theory of evolution? And in what ways, if at all, do they experience confluence or conflict between their scientific and cultural or religious convictions in the study of evolution? To this, we executed the measure of acceptance of the theory of evolution with certain emendations and adaptations and translations that we worked on. We have a lot of data to present there. We found out a lot about who thinks what about evolution, and which is very interesting data, and we're excited to share it with you. The one thing you'll see is that most of our data is about Jews and Muslims, because the Christians in Israel are a small minority. And one of the reasons I'm delighted that David prepared the paper that he did is that we wanted a conversation between these three faiths. And so that will enable us sort of to use our UK connection to have that conversation in a way that really haven't been able to do so here in Israel. And finally, the fourth question, in what ways, if at all, might a dialogue between these domains assist students and teachers in considering how knowledge works in each of these disciplines and the potential contribution of each to the human search for meaning, purpose, and truth? That's our final question. The final session will say something about that. We're a long ways to being able to say something interesting about that. But about the first three questions, I think we have a lot to say. The first question is primarily a philosophical question. So we'll have, after our opening session, a lengthy philosophical conversation, which we're looking forward to. The second question, we executed extensive qualitative interviews. The third question, we both administered the MATE instrument, and we also did a Delphi study, and we're going to talk about both the MATE and the Delphi study, and it's going to give us some very interesting things to talk about, I think. And then the final question, when the data all sort of comes down and is completed and sorted and analyzed, hopefully we'll be able to say something intelligent about that. So that's sort of the structure of the study. I do want to say something about Israeli state education, because it looks a little bit, every state education system has its own sort of shape and contours. In Israel, there are 4 streams of education, each which addresses the needs of a different population. You might call them the ideological needs, or in some cases you could even call them the theological commitments of different groups, or the national or linguistic needs. The largest group are the state general schools, which serves the population of secular Jews in Israel, secular humanistic Jews. I'm going to try and say something about that ideology a little bit later to give some meat to the bones. Secular Judaism in Israel is not a default. Secular cultural Judaism is a broad, rich, and in many respects defined Jewish ideology. It's a way of identifying as a Jew, an important way of identifying as a Jew, and it's important we put that out there. It's not a rejection of something. It's an assertion of certain important claims, and those schools seek to address those kinds of assertions in the way in which they run the school system. State Jewish religious schools are religious schools that are from the religious Zionist movement or the religious national movement, which is a certain part of the Zionist movement about which I'll also say a little bit later, but they're Orthodox schools. They're schools that essentially have as their religious theology a certain kind of orthodoxy. In the United States or in the UK, we might call it modern orthodoxy, a form of modern orthodoxy, as opposed to the ultra-Orthodox or independent schools, which are a more literalist form of Judaism. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the distinctions between religious Zionism and ultra-Orthodoxy a little bit later. Our study doesn't deal with ultra-Orthodox schools, because ultra-Orthodox schools are, for the most part, independent of the Ministry of Education. In Israel, you can't say anything blanket. Most of those schools now get state funding in one form or another, sometimes through the ministry, sometimes through the Prime Minister's office, sometimes through other ministries. So they do get state funding, but they're not under the direct supervision of the state system, and so they're not in the purview of our study. And then there are state Arab schools that serve the largely Sunni Muslim population in Israel. The language of instruction is Arabic. And religious instruction is primarily Muslim education, though there is some Christian education in those schools as well. And those schools are under the supervision of the Ministry of Education. So our study deals with the state general schools, the state Jewish religious schools, and the state, they're not only Arabic language schools, they're Arab schools. They're schools that teach in the Arabic language, that teach Arabic culture, and that they address the population of Israeli Arabs, or sometimes refer to themselves as Palestinian citizens of Israel. In the state general schools, Hebrew is the language of instruction. As we said, they serve mostly secular and traditional Jewish students. The state religious schools, Hebrew is the language of instruction. So they serve mostly modern Orthodox and to a smaller extent, traditional Jewish students. And I'm going to say a little bit about those theological positions a little bit later. The state Arab sector schools, Arabic is the language of instruction. They serve mostly Sunni Muslims and to some extent Christian. And the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox independent schools, oftentimes Yiddish is the language of instruction. They serve Hasidic and non-Hasidic ultra-Orthodox students, both of Ashkenazi, that is European origin, and also Mizrahi or Sephardi, Middle Eastern and North African origin. And as I say, those schools are out of our purview. So just to give you a little sense, in the two basic subject matters that we sought to study, the science curriculum, the biology curriculum, the place where evolution would naturally sit, as well as other STEM-related fields, is basically a common curriculum across the three streams that we studied. The science curriculum was one curriculum for the state general schools, for the state religious schools, and for the state Arab schools. Whereas other topics that might be thought of as more ideologically loaded, although evolution, as we've learned, also has some ideological load to it. But topics like literature, history, Bible, or religious education, those curriculum might differ in various different ways among these three different populations. For example, in the Arab sector schools, they have a structure called religious education, which is Muslim education. Whereas in the secular schools, the secular Jewish schools, there is no religious education because the schools are not religious, but there is a form of Jewish identity education, and that is done among other subjects in the teaching of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is a required subject in the secular system, and so we chose to identify the Hebrew Bible curriculum, which is taken by all kids in the schools, as the equivalent, more or less, of what you might call religious education in British schools, especially for kids that are not necessarily religious. And in the state religious schools, there is religious education. It's much broader than Bible. It includes rabbinic literature and a whole host of other subjects, which was too broad for the structure of our study. So we chose actually to focus on the Bible curriculum in the state religious schools as well. Also, those curricula they're overlap. There's comparison between them. So it made it possible. And there is to some extent dialogue between them. It would be nice if there were a little more, but there's some extent dialogue between them. So when we're talking about, as it were, the category of religious education, the subject matter in the schools, in the Israeli schools, is Hebrew Bible, whereas the subject matter in the Muslim schools is Muslim religion. So the Quran is the main religious text that's talked about in the Muslim schools. The Hebrew Bible, interpreted differently, things that I'll say about a little bit later, are what talked about in the state religious schools. Okay, so that's by way of introduction and a little bit about the study. We're looking forward to a wonderful conversation. And we're going to begin, I think, to our first session. So what I'm going to do for the first session, so I can move out of the way, we got some Yeah.
Can I also do one more thank you that I see that John Levy is also logged on. I've never met you, John, but thank you for co-sponsoring the event. The Academic Study Group, along with the British Council, is helping this be a joint event between the UK and Israel.
So our opening talk, we've asked Professor Michael Reiss to give us a broad perspective. This is an opportunity also to say thank you to Michael for his support in this project all the way through. Michael's been, I would say, a dear and close friend of this project and helping us think through both how to frame it, how to get it funded, and then advising us as we go through. So it's entirely appropriate that we have an opportunity to hear something of substance from Michael. Michael Reiss is Professor of Science Education at UCL's Faculty of Education and Society, a Fellow of the Academic. What you sent here doesn't, I'm just reading it out here, Michael. This is a Fellow of the Academic Society of Social Sciences and a priest in the Church of England. His academic interests are in science education, bioethics, and sex education. He is president of the Association of Science Education, the International Society of Science and Religion, and the International Association for Science and Religion in Schools, a member of the Newfield Council on Bioethics, and writes on the interface of science, education, and theology. We're going to have two responses. I'm just going to give a word about it, the respondents now, so I don't have to interrupt again, and then we'll go on. Denis Alexander will be the first respondent. Denis has also been part of our advisory team throughout, and this is an opportunity to thank Denis for his support as well. Dr. Denis Alexander is the founding director, now emeritus, of the Faraday Institute of Science and Religion at Cambridge, where he is emeritus fellow of St. Edmund's College. He's a past chair of the molecular immunology program and head of the laboratory of lymphoetic signaling and development at the Barham Institute in Cambridge. Dr. Alexander spent 15 years developing university departments and laboratories in the Middle East, and therefore has extensive experience of teaching the biological sciences within Muslim environments. And our third response is Ayelet Shavit, who is just joining us for the first time, and it's a pleasure to have you here and to have a chance to interact. And I just pulled a few things off the web. Professor Ayelet Shavit is professor of biology and the 2018 winner of the Higher Education Prize for Young Faculty Members, awarded by the Council of Education, the Council of Higher Education here in Israel, which is really a very, very distinguished honor among young academics here in Israel. She is a member of the faculty at Tel-Hai College in the beautiful Upper Galilee, and also now a new member of the Technion, where she specializes in philosophy of science, evolution of cooperation, and biodiversity. Her specialties include involved philosophy of science, evolution, cooperation, and biodiversity conservation. So that's our first session. Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Well, Hanan, thank you very much for the generous introduction, and Tali for hosting us, and a particular thank to Rachel and to Nijma, because the amount of organisation that this has required, particularly for those of us travelling from the UK, has been considerable, and it's worked really well. So that's very much appreciated. Thank you also, Tali, for, I think, going to go and stop the noise from outside. I have given presentations where people have, I think, felt occasionally going and starting noise outside. So that's really thoughtful. Thank you very much indeed. When I saw Rachel this morning, we were chatting about this. She was honest enough, because she and I have known each other for quite a few years by now, to say that her response, and I gather the response of at least one of the two people who are kindly going to respond to this on seeing my presentation was, is that it? So it is quite thin in terms of the words on the screen, and that's just a tradition that I'm comfortable with, because it allows me to respond to the audience and to feel whether I'm going too slowly or need to unpack things more, or whether people get interested at a certain stage, etc., etc. I've got a great title. I think I was given it, Evolution, Education, Science, Identity, and the Aims of Education. And as Hanan has indicated, it is very much the first in these 2 days. So it's an introductory session. So I'm particularly aware that because of that, quite a number of the issues that I'll be getting onto will be picked up in other talks in more detail. And I've already had conversations with people where that's obviously the case, either in what they're going to say or in current research that they're doing. And I think that's absolutely fine, but it will be therefore quite broad ranging. Now, let me, as it were, start the real talk by saying that one often hears the statement that the topic of evolution is conceptually difficult. And in one sense, I agree with this, and we'll go on to discuss how it's difficult. But it is a very odd statement in and of itself, because actually difficulty is surely a manifestation of the relationship between the subject or issue or topic and the person who's thinking about it. So I'm perfectly used when I was at school and I did our exams when you're roughly sort of 16, 17, 18, double mathematics, physics and chemistry. People sometimes subsequently say, ooh, that sounds very difficult. But of course, the reason I did them is precisely because to me, they were the easiest subjects I could do. The friends of mine who did English, history and French, well, good luck for them. I wouldn't have got into a really strong university if I'd done those subjects. So it is a slightly odd idea just in and of itself. That having been said, there are reasons why certainly, at least compared to many other topics in biology, evolution for most people can be said to be conceptually demanding or difficult. For a start, there is this quite interesting relationship between the concrete and the abstract. So when I taught in schools or undergraduates, evolutionary biology, quite a lot of it can be very concrete. There are different ways of doing this, but one very common approach is a slightly simplified historical approach, which to biologists does tend to only start with the work of Lamarck and Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace and these other great biologists of the late 18th and 19th century. And then you tell stories about Mendel and his peas and Rosalind Franklin and the work she did and so forth. So that's all pretty concrete. But of course, there are major abstract issues. Now, I'd written the phrase, the unit of selection, before realizing that Ayelet works academically on cooperation. So I'm slightly worried now that almost anything I say in this talk, there's going to be at least one person who knows more about it academically than I do. But I will take a deep breath and plow on anyway. One of the things that is most difficult to help students, you don't even really do it at school level, but you do it undergraduate level when you're teaching, is to get them to think about the unit of selection, which roughly speaking means the level at which natural selection is working. And this is because most of the people who've worked in the field are extremely sure that there's one level that's most important. So somebody will just know from popular psychology that in the 1970s, Richard Dawkins, it wasn't just him, but others, gave voice to the argument that the gene is what drives selection. Selection happens at the level of the gene, hence his rather powerful phrase, the selfish gene, that in a non-literal, i.e. metaphorical sense, particular genes are doing what is best for them. Most people think of evolution happening at the level of individuals, which is in many ways the most straightforward thing. You know, we see a natural history film of a lion hunting, and you think, yes, the lion needs to catch the gazelle, that's for the benefit of the lion. The gazelle needs to escape, that's for the benefit of the gazelle. It all makes sense. But of course, then, you immediately come up with a problem that actually lions are social creatures. So animals that didn't catch the gazelle end up eating bits of the gazelle. And anyway, the whole point of being a lion, the entire evolutionary point of being a lion is to end up having baby lions in the next generation. Well, those are individuals. So the individual parent is not doing what's best just for the individual parent in a very narrow sense, et cetera, et cetera. So thinking through the levels of selection, and I haven't even got on to what's often called group selection and so on, is demanding. But if you want a good understanding of evolution, you need to think about those things. Then there's the issue of scale. So if one thinks of a fairly standard story, for example, as to why quite a lot of people have sickle cell anemia, a particular so-called genetic disease, though that is a dangerous shorthand, though it's nearer the truth for something like sickle cell disease than for many other conditions. At one level, what's going on can only be understood by the level of changes in the bases. That's literally parts of the molecule of DNA. So that's sub-microscopic. But then a lot of evolution is about understanding what happens at the microscopic level, the behavior of chromosomes and so on. And then, of course, there's the macroscopic, what happens to the individual who has sickle cell anemia. And indeed, if you really want to understand what's happening in sickle cell anemia, you need to think not only about individuals, but about populations. And to biologists, which I won't go into now, there's a fairly precise understanding of what we mean about the word population. It's a bit more rigorous, bounded than in everyday conversation. And to really understand about evolution, you do need to understand the way that forces operate at all these different levels. Then it does happen over very long periods of time. This might not be thought to make it conceptually difficult, but actually it does. Because, of course, I'm an evolutionary biologist by background, we did not evolve to be able conceptually to think about very long periods of time. We did evolve to think about quite big ranges of scale, not submicroscopic or even microscopic, but you do things that are very close to you, and that's important. And you need to be able to see that lion or whatever it is, or the food source quite a distance away. So there's quite a bit of variation in scale. But in terms of time, there are the historical myths and stories of your ancestors and the tribe more generally. There's yourselves, and there's your children, and maybe one more generation, and that's it. One of the very standard exercises done, certainly in England, when helping biology graduates to train to become secondary teachers of biology, is to go out of doors them. It's more fun out of doors with a very long piece of string. The most fun is if you have a piece of string that is 48 meters long. 48 meters long. And the reason for this is you're going to use the string as an analogy for the roughly 4.8 thousand million years that we're fairly confident the Earth has existed for. So if you do that, 48 meters, 4.8 thousand million years, you find that the last million years is a centimeter. You then get students to put things on this string that have happened. And of course, it's very odd for them because 99.8% of the string's just got nothing on it. And then what they think of as everything interesting squashed up at the end. Humans evolved, depends how you determine what these things are, but the order of a couple of 100,000-ish years ago. So that's a couple of millimeters from the end, for example. You can put in the dinosaurs and things like that. But very long periods of time, deep time, as it's often referred to, is difficult for people to think about. And that's very relevant in evolution because the way that evolution works, roughly speaking, is not just linearly proportional to time. It's more than that. It's rather like, those exponential economic models. If only any of us had invested in my country 1 penny, here it could be slightly more, let's say 1 shekel at the time of whatever it is, let's say the Second Temple, the amount of money we'd have by now with even just normal rates at which interest is paid would make us one of the most wealthy people in the country. People are not good at imagining the consequences of long periods of time. And we're talking about, a couple of thousand years, and I'm talking about 4.8 thousand million years. Finally, of course, evolution, you don't have quite the range of experiments you can do, let's say, in molecular biology or chemistry. This, of course, causes some people who don't accept the theory of evolution to immediately say it's not science, but of course there are other sciences, of which astronomy is usually held up as the most notable example, where there are even fewer experiments you can do, because you can do some experiments in evolution, but they're just quite bounded by scale and by time. And then the last of these bullet points about why I think evolution is, for most people, conceptually demanding relative to other areas of biology, is the value of imaginaries and counterfactuals. So counterfactuals, of course, are instances, well, imagine what would have happened if. So the one well-known example is if we hadn't been hit by that asteroid some 67,000 million years ago. So start again, some 67 million years ago, that led, roughly speaking, to the extinction of the dinosaurs. And you probably wouldn't have got the adaptive radiation of mammals, and we probably wouldn't have this seminar today. I mean, there'd be other consequences as well, but that's one of the consequences. Now, in my experience of teaching, some students love counterfactuals and actually really get into them, and it can help them understand evolution better. But a lot of people teaching evolution don't sort of teach like that, because that's not really how we're trained to teach as science educators. Imaginaries are just even more so, roughly speaking. They're not just counterfactuals of just specific historical instances. They're much more open-ended. Okay, so the topic of evolution is conceptually difficult for many people. Oh, I'd forgotten, there was that final one I put on. It's very difficult for most people to understand the way in which, as apparently a goal-orientated set of activities as evolution can be driven by non-agential forces. That's a rather formal way of putting it. But even people who are very comfortable with the mainstream theory of evolution and the standard evolutionary story tend to think that there are certain crucial points where the sort of absolute pure science story isn't enough, and where something must have been leading to some sort of directional goal, as it were. Now, I won't go into long lectures now about how there are standard scientific accounts as to why this might not be the case, but people just think that, evolution seems to have led to creatures like us, pinnacle of evolution. And the best analogy I think I can give is that if you think of what happens within a single cell, it is driven, of course, ultimately only by diffusion in terms of the movement of the molecules within the cell. Now, you can have concentration gradients and expenditure of energy, which make certain things happen, which is where pure diffusion on its own would not. But all of those ultimately are due to diffusion and energy sources from outside the system. But if you've ever seen those wonderful videos of what goes on within the cell, these are models, they're not real photographs. You can see the photos, but the models tend to show it more clearly. There appears to be incredible purpose even within the cell, for example, in repair, even though it's driven by diffusion. So I think what I would say is that for scientists working in evolution, when they're working in their day-to-day studies, they don't think about purpose or teleology at all, and still maintain that everything we see in the natural world around us can be explained within a framework that doesn't have any sort of goal direction. So conceptually difficult. Now, we know, of course, as well, which is really part of the reason for this grant for our meeting today, that while evolution is a biological topic, it intersects with religion. Now, there are hermeneutical issues here to do with interpretations, both of scriptures and of cultural practices. And my usual advice to science teachers in schools is just don't get into those, because you're not a trained expert on that. And one of the interesting things about this project is it's trying rather more to explore some of these issues to do with understandings of both scriptures and cultural practices. And then, of course, there are obviously mainstream important theological and metaphysical issues raised by evolution. Slightly more concretely, it seems to me that the key aspects of evolution that are contentious for many, some people might want some, I'm not too bothered, this is not meant to be some quantitative analysis, but that are contentious to quite a number of people who have a religious faith, are first of all, the idea of common descent. So as I think you will without doubt all know, the universally held view within mainstream evolutionary biology is that all of life has a common ancestor, usually described as Luca, the last universal common ancestor, thought to have lived about 3.5 to 3.8 thousand billion years ago. It's not thought, of course, that Luca at that point was the only living entity. There were huge numbers of others. It's just all the others have died out and left at best the most fragmentary of records in history. Common descent, again, is quite difficult for many people to really get their mind around. You know, we're not just talking about, are we related to the great apes or even mammals? It's all of life, genuinely all of life. Then there's the age of the earth. I've already mentioned, I'm very well aware that for some religions, this isn't an issue at all, of course, mainly because their scriptures don't make any particular reference to the age of the earth. But for other religions, and particularly some denominations within Christianity, it's a very, very core issue indeed. And then this business about no directionality, which I touched on in the last slide on the bullet point about purpose and teleology. So questionnaires often have limitations for getting to grips with people's understanding of or acceptance of evolution. But when you do interviews with people, you quite often find, for example, that even people who describe themselves as not having a significant religious faith and people who accept the mainstream theory of evolution sort of think there might have been one or two important points at which something happened which can't really straightforwardly be explained by science. The two classic points being the origin of life in itself, and then something about origin of humans, either literally anatomically humans or some sort of spark leading us to be, as it were, rather distinct, as I'll go on to discuss in a moment, from the rest of organisms. Biologists would hold there is no such thing as a scala naturae. Now, let me give you an example. This is the Aristotelian classic version of a scala naturae, a scale or a ladder of nature, which is a wonderfully common sense way of seeing life, that you start off at the bottom with things that are not living, inanimate matter. You go through things like what used to be called, this is an old, as you can see, slide deliberately because I'm trying to get closer to how Aristotle thought of it. So lower plants, that's things like mosses and liverworts and fungi. And then you go through the higher plants. So that's the gymnosperms, the cone-bearing plants like pines and larches, and the flowering plants. All the ones that have coloured flowers, but also the grasses and so on. And then I won't go into great detail, but you can see it's the same thing with animals. You have sponges, which we now do think of as animals, but used to be thought of as a special case. And as always in these sort of approaches, humans, so man in the language of the day, are at the top. Now, of course, biologists are not keen on that at all. So this is just the front cover of a book. It doesn't show it superbly well, but it's a good attempt to try and not just have humans at the top. So you can see there are turtles and alligators and snakes. So it does seem to be rather biased towards vertebrates, this particular visual demonstration. But the illustrator has obviously made an effort because down here in the lower half, we have man. Now, it's not a perfect, I'm not selling this as the way to understand the tree of life. And in fact, I think one could talk for quite a long time about the particular representation there of humanity. But to biologists, of course, and Darwin got this in Tali, Darwin wrote in his notebook very early on, there isn't this sort of ordering. Darwin thought, and I think most biologists would thought, that in one sense, over time, things are becoming better and better adapted. He's happy with that. For some reason, a lot of evolutionary biologists don't very much even like saying that, but I always think it's absolutely fine. You have to remember that what they're becoming better adapted to is a movable feast, because the most important aspect of the environment for most organisms is other organisms, and they're all trying to get better adapted. So this led to what's been called the Red Queen effect. I can't ask those of you who are at a distance on Zoom because I can't see you put your hands up, but can I just ask, has anybody here heard of the Red Queen effect? That's great. That's about 2.5 people. Briefly, the Red Queen effect is named after the book by Lewis Carroll's Charles Dodgson, where suddenly Alice is grabbed by the hand and has to run very, very fast. And when finally they stop, she's very surprised to find they're in the same place. And she says so. This is bizarre. And the person who's taken her by the hand says, no, we'd have had to run much faster to actually get anywhere. You have to work hard just to survive, just to exist. You have to evolve against all the creatures around you, both in your species and things that you're trying to eat and don't want to be eaten by you, and things that want to eat, things that you don't want to be eaten by but do want to eat you. Right. Now, evolution and identity. How special are we, by which I mean humans, and in what ways are we special? For a long time, the standard approach by biologists was what I think I could call a functional approach. So it goes through things like tool use, language, morality, spirituality, etc. This approach still has great value. Clearly, we make tools in a way that is, frankly, utterly distinct from the way that any other species makes tools. But we now don't think of it as a binary, as we once did. Some of you will know the rather wonderful, I always think, story of Jane Goodall, who didn't go to university, went out to Africa, genuinely wanting to work with chimpanzees because she'd been given a toy chimpanzee when she was about 3 or 4 years old from London Zoo, and managed to get 6 months working with one of the leakies. And in that 6 months, found the chimpanzees using tools, in other words, seizing things, in that case, twigs, and using the twigs to get at termites, which they otherwise wouldn't have been able to reach. And that led to the research project, which is still funded to that day. And there are loads of other species now that we use tools. As I say, they might use them in the way those who've got children have sort of 2 or 3 year olds. And there are some cases of crows where you can just about argue that their capabilities are a bit like a sort of 4.5-year-old child on average, but that's about it. Language, it's exactly the same story. There's no longer the division we thought there are. I don't just mean the fact rather trivially that you can teach spoken English or any other human language to animals, but more that you can teach communication systems to particularly the higher apes it's mostly been done with. And even more interestingly, in nature, there are lots of animals that, of course, do use language. I am a biologist, so I'm not careful. I can talk for far too long about this, but one of the most elegant examples, which some of you will know, is communication in honeybees. That honeybees have a wonderful, totally abstract way of communicating the distance to good food sources. By totally abstract, I mean it's to do with the rate at which they move in a dimension which is utterly distinct from the direction or anything like that of the food source. They use the direction to signal which way to go off in. And there are a number of animals that have language, whether spoken or in the bees' case, not particularly spoken. Morality is more interesting because, again, my own view is a very common sense view. It's the same as tool use and language, but we clearly have systems of morality that are more sophisticated than any other animals. But actually, the difference between our moral systems and the moral systems of the other great apes, bonobos, chimps, etc., gorillas, is not as great as the difference between our tool use and our language and other species. By which I'm not saying, Kant and the others, were not much better than a gorilla or anything like that, stupidly. I'm talking about the ordinary moral systems that people use in their everyday lives are not of a different order compared to those used in many other social vertebrate systems, and not just apes, the ones used in some birds, for example, and so on. They're all to do with issues of fairness, distribution of resources, access to other individuals, whether for sexual purposes, for care, status. There's a huge amount in many species about how you behave to animals of different status and ways you behave, trying to enhance your status. Spirituality, in many ways, it looks like a bit of a more distinct difference. Again, one of the conversations I had before we got started, I find there's somebody working academically in this area who therefore knows rather a lot more than I do. But I've always been, and this is about the thing I'm going to say now I'm least confident of in this presentation. I've always not only been rather moved by, but wouldn't entirely reject what some might regard as a quite fanciful interpretation of what's going on in the minds of some non-human animals when they come, for example, across creatures that they've known that have recently died. This is often popularized through things like elephant graveyards, but some of you will have seen, because they've been in television programs and there are videos of the way that elephants move near conspecifics who've died, and then sometimes revisit years later where they've died. And there are similar stories for a number of domesticated creatures, particularly dogs. And for myself, I think what I would see this is as a sort of proto-spirituality in non-humans, just like you get pro-sociality, pro-morality, et cetera, et cetera. And again, being an evolutionary biologists, we don't tend to like absolute jumps. Everything's a slow-moving continuum that's happened over long periods of time. So rather like the individual and their development from birth through childhood and so on, develops all these things, tool use, language, morality, spirituality. So we see over much longer periods of time these things having evolved. Then, of course, there's a completely different approach to human identity in terms of religion, where one thinks about origins from a divine creator. So whether it's, Tselem Elohim or Imago Dei, the idea that humans are special because in some way we reflect, which in a sense, in the Christian tradition is a religious term that one can spend hours talking about because different words have been used, but in some way we reflect or bear the image or some aspect of that which is the divine that created us. And of course, the rather concrete attempts to understand Imago Dei often used to go back to the functional approach and talk about things like morality, language, rationality at one point featured quite strongly. Theologians now have a range of ways of understanding this. The relational aspect is more important now than it used to be until the last 20 years or so. All of this is taking place historically within a move to de-center humans in the sense of, in some people's eyes, making us less important. So the Copernican Revolution, and the reason it was so important was because, of course, it led to a physical decentering of us. We, the inhabitants of Earth, are no longer on the planet that is at the center of the solar system. Indeed, of course, subsequently, it's occasionally put rather oddly as, we are only on some galaxy at the edge of, as if being at the edge of somehow immediately diminished your importance or significance. So it's slightly odd in a way, but nevertheless, it was a huge decentering. Darwin, I've mentioned already, and clearly has led to a fundamentally different way of people seeing themselves. I, of course, belong to the camp that doesn't see it in any way as reducing or denigrating the value of humanity. but it's a rather nice way, actually, the other way round almost, of both theologically and biologically thinking rather more about the value of the rest of the natural world. And of course, there's been an enormous growth. Again, some experts writing here in eco-theology, where people have tried seriously to think about what the lessons are for theology about the diversity of the natural world. Freud, without giving a lecture on Freud, roughly speaking, helped de-emphasize the importance of human rationality in the way we act and who we are. Didn't get rid of it, but just pointed out that an awful lot of what drives us is not rational. It comes from our subconscious for reasons that are often to do with the way we grew up as children and are important. I'm not a Jungian. For any of you who are, of course, Jung, in a sense, takes it a stage further and is quite keen on a collective, well, not quite keen, argues strongly for a collective unconscious and archetypes. But as these sit both outside of mainstream evolution biology and outside of mainstream religion, they're slightly beyond this presentation. Then separately, evolution does raise what could be called existential concerns. And I've just had a doctoral student, and it's all her work. It wasn't my idea. It was hers entirely, Emma Newell, who is now hoping beginning to start publishing on this. She's just got one short paper for school teachers of about 3 years ago to at least get her ideas out there. What Emma did, the short version, is she interviewed 18 young adults very carefully and in some depth. And for, you don't have to quantify, but let's say most of them, over half, found that they're beginning to think seriously about evolution in a 1-hour session throws up a lot of anxieties. And these are not, there was one of them it was, but they're not to do with religion. So these are not people who are finding evolution troubling because it contradicts or interferes with their understanding of their scriptures or their religious tradition, beliefs or practices. These are because it raises issues of evolution to do with death, to do with extinction, and to do with an apparent absence of meaning. So I mentioned that there. And then briefly, I just want to finish. I'm not going to do the whole aims of education, but specifically to teaching the evolution. And none of this is new. This is all stuff I've said before. And it's just Michael's views now. So it's a bit less balanced than what I've said so far. So my own view is everyone, by which I include children brought up in families that reject the theory of evolution, everyone should understand the theory of evolution. So intellectually, realize what its arguments are, and so on. This is not an argument about doing well in science exams. Sometimes it's put that one should teach evolution instrumentally. That's a pathetic argument. It's about understanding what scientists think. Evolution is the most important theory for biologists, full stop. And it's just like understanding theories in any other area of human knowledge. You don't have to be a Marxist, but if you want to be well educated, you ought to understand Marxism a bit. It's ridiculous not to. You don't have to. I can plod through every single bit of human thought in this way. But it's as straightforward as that. And in fact, the more we taught a wide, diverse range of understanding, either ourselves or the world or economics or art or music or biology, the better it would be, frankly, because it'd be clear that's what we're trying to do. When I've said this before, people occasionally, let's go on to the next point, it's better made there. The segue, that segues into, I don't see a justification for promoting acceptance of evolution. And I happen to think this would be rather useful for the families who are very hesitant about their children being exposed to evolution education, because if we were quite clear-cut, no, the aim isn't to accept it, it's to understand it. They might, if they really accepted that, in the sense of believe that, be a bit more comfortable about their children being subjected to the theory. They might not, because they still might see it as, the sort of work of Satan in one tradition, for example, and it's therefore just better not to come across it. But they might, particularly because, of course, if you're well educated about evolution, it's easier for you to mount an intellectual defense against it. So I've quite enjoyed in my time doing a number of debates with creationists or intelligent design advocates. And in my experience, they have usually been much better prepared about the arguments to do with evolution than when I've given arguments about religion with certain well-known atheists who've just tended to assume religion is all a waste of time and rubbish, so haven't prepared to be very careful. Certain atheists in this room excluded from that. But I do remember having debated with some very well-known ones where you give the most sort of 101 argument and people rather nicely saying, well, I never thought of that. Things like that. Analogy, topical at the moment because of COVID, the way we teach vaccines in schools at the moment in most countries around the world is exactly as how we used to, and still in some places do, teach evolution. You go through the biology of it, and then there's just a presumption that it's a good thing. You ought to accept it. And the either hidden or sometimes slightly more overt message given about vaccine hesitancy is that anybody who doesn't get vaccinated or any parents who don't agree to get their children vaccinated must be either stupid or selfish. Now, by the way, fully vaccinated, very keen on vaccines, etc., but I don't happen to think that follows at all. It is not the case that some people who choose not to get vaccinated themselves or have their children vaccinated are stupid or selfish. It's often because they come from backgrounds where states have been less than honest about things like vaccines. To give just one example of this, which you may know, when the Americans were quite keen to capture Osama bin Laden, the CIA went in with a purported vaccine program in parts of Pakistan, the entire aim of which was to obtain blood samples that could be DNA sequenced to find relatives of Osama bin Laden. This is not secret. This is now absolutely mainstream academic journalism. It was all hidden in secret for a while. Not very surprisingly, when that got found out, it led to rather a large drop in trust and far fewer children getting vaccinated. And there have been various calculations done about how many thousands of people died as a direct result through catching the diseases against which they would have otherwise been protected. So without going into too much of a lecture about vaccine hesitancy, I think we do well for both evolution and vaccines for separating this understanding and acceptance, which is exactly one of the things this project is wrestling with, as Hanan read out our first research question. And by the way, the data we have for evolution suggests that the better you teach it in terms of being more thoughtful and not pushing it onto people, actually, the more likely people are to end up accepting it, which is not very surprising. Many people reject everything's forced onto them and quite like it when it's just clear that's not the case. Is evolution controversial? So again, this will be part of one of the talks coming later. The only thing I'd briefly say is it depends what you mean by controversial. So as somebody else here has written very clearly for many years, if you mean, is it sort of epistemically controversial? Is it controversial within the community of evolution biologists, mainstream science? The answer is no. If you have a more everyday understanding of the word controversial, which might be better described as contentious, something like that, well, there are clearly some parts of the world where it's not contentious, and there are some parts of the world where it's far more contentious. And this project is precisely because for many people in Israel, it is contentious. And to repeat myself, if that's what one means by controversial, then it's a controversial issue. But I think this is the last point I'll make, and some of you know this, because I first really argued this in a session that Hanan organized a number of years ago. I think there's a lot to be said, certainly at school level, for treating evolution as a sensitive issue. And the reason for this is that sensitive, I just mean that everyday word. So all of us, if we're with somebody who is going through a very tough time. Well, I say all of us, certain psychopaths accepted, but 90+% of people just automatically are more considerate, caring, sensitive, gentle to somebody when they know a topic is important. So RE teachers in parts of the world that teach religion quite often are good at knowing that religion means different things to different people and are quite careful introducing it in the way that, for example, the typical maths teacher introducing polynomials is not, because it's not, in that sense, a sensitive issue. So people are sensitive, teachers are people, there we are, Aristotelian syllogistic reasoning. It would be a good idea, given that evolution is quite a sensitive topic, for it to be treated as such, because it requires no in-service training. So it's a universally applicable, free solution to how to deal with the problem. And anyway, a lot of subject teachers are rather good at teaching in that way anyway, when they don't claim that we're certain about certain things. Great. I think that's me finished. Thank you.
Yes, so good to be with you. And let me say what a pleasure it is to be able to respond to my friend Michael's very helpful interview, his overview rather, not an interview. And I think that really does set the scene very effectively for what is to come. I just want to say also that I'm very sorry to not be with you there in person. I'd love to be there, but of course it hasn't worked out this time. And as Hanan was mentioning earlier on, I think my own experience in this field comes from teaching the biological sciences in various parts of the world in which the Muslim religion has been dominant, but also in the context of the work of the Faraday Institute here in Cambridge for Science and Religion. I've done a lot of lecturing in different parts of the world, with very different cultures and very different views concerning the topic of this particular conference. So all I want to do today in my quite brief talk here is to just highlight 3 different points. They've already, I think, mostly, not entirely, been introduced by Michael. And these are ones that I've personally frequently encountered when engaging with the topic of evolution in these very different cultural contexts. The first is a very general point. It's actually even more general than Michael's own introductory points. And I think it's one that does heavily influence the science religion discussion in different cultures, which includes clearly the discussion about evolution. And that's the very distinct use of the word science in different languages and cultures. And I think this is actually a key point when teaching evolution with religious students present, or perhaps teaching in a religious school. And as we all know, in the early modern period, the classics, theology, philosophy, what we now call science, were all integrated together into this Latin scientia, this one great body of learning. And those engaged in scientia were known as natural philosophers. When I cycle past Trinity College, Newton's old college here in Cambridge, which I do quite often, I sometimes wonder what Isaac Newton would have said had I asked him in the 17th century what he thought about the relationship between science and religion. I think he would have looked very puzzled and asked me what I was talking about. He wasn't the most polite of people, actually, as we happen to know from his writings. But also Newton spent a huge amount of time studying his Bible, along with the time he spent on gravity, optics, arguing with Leibniz about calculus, a few other things. But the discoveries made from the Bible study, clearly in his mind, were all likewise part of his scientia. It wasn't really until the 19th century that the various scientific disciplines began to emerge with separate labels such as physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth. And it was in 1834, 170 years after Newton, that the master of Trinity College in Cambridge at that time, the Reverend William Whewell, invented the word scientist. I think most scientists, certainly in my country, don't realize that the name of their profession in English, at least, was invented by a 19th century Anglican priest. But it wasn't really until the final decades of the 19th century that natural philosophers started calling themselves scientists. And as the historian Peter Harrison points out, in 1800, the term natural philosophy was still dominant in English books, but by 1900, it had almost been completely replaced by the term natural sciences. And science became more professionalized as it began to generate increasingly specialized bodies of constructed knowledge. And of course, that's a process which continues right up to the present day. And so now science in English is generally taken to refer to the natural sciences. You go to any university in this country, ask the way to a science department, well, that's where you'll be directed, to chemistry, physics, biology, whatever it is. But I think the key point here is that the situation is really different from English and other languages. Wissenschaft, German word for science, as you know, but its meaning is much broader than science in English. It really refers to scientia, any body of constructed academic knowledge, be it in the sciences or in the humanities. And this is the case when you start going through this, la science in French, or ilim in Arabic, or bilim in Turkish, and so forth. And in fact, it turns out that all the words for science used in all the languages of the world, as far as I know, please correct me later in the discussion if you find an exception, but they're all pretty much closer to scientia in their meaning than in English. And it's really only in English that the default meaning of science is the natural sciences. And that's significant, I think, for our discussion today. So if we just take Arabic as an example, we find that each branch of science has its own name, but all branches of science have that common prefix ilim. So the Quran contains a form of sacred knowledge. It contains ilim. So now as we teach evolution, which touches on all those questions of human identity that Michael has so helpfully highlighted for us, and which the Quran also touches on, it seems that we have two branches here of ilim that seem to be in conflict. And clearly the ilim, the science of the Holy Quran, comes first. And in the case of evolution, the problem is made even more complex because in many languages, the word used for evolution also has many different meanings and ideological overtones. And certainly if you mention the name Charles Darwin, in some parts of the world, strong ideological overtones. For example, in Turkey, where I once taught the biological sciences for 9 years at university level, the ideological connotations of evolution go back to the late Ottoman era. As Turkish commentator Mustafa Akyol comments, and I quote, self-declared materialist Ottoman thinkers, among them Abdullah Cevdet and Supi Etham, translated the works of evolutionary scientists, including the German biologist Ernest Haeckel. In turn, some Islamist Ottoman thinkers like Ismail Ertuğrul and Ahmet Hilmi wrote refutations of the school of materialism, raising arguments that also challenged the theory of evolution. Now, of course, as you know, probably Haeckel was strongly materialistic in his understanding and presentation of Darwin's new theory, and so Darwin's name became associated with materialistic secular philosophy very early on in Turkey, as we can see from Mustafa's quote there. And Darwin's Origin of Species actually wasn't published in Turkey. I think it wasn't until around 1970. Ednan can maybe correct me later on, but it was really, at least, it was more than 100 years after the original edition came out by Darwin in English in 1859. And so what happened in this case is that there was a whole century when evolution in Turkish was really an ideologically loaded word, and there was no easy access to what Darwin himself had actually written about his biological theory. So if the language game is one big challenge in teaching evolution in religious contexts, then another one is the human identity challenge that Michael has already flagged up for us. A few years ago, I think it was actually 10 years ago, 2012, I was invited as part of a Cambridge University delegation to Kuala Lumpur to take part in a science and religion conference organized by the University of Malaya, organized within then a strong Muslim environment. There was a big crowd there. The topic attracted a lot of attention. There were faculty, graduate students, and there was the Vice Chancellor sitting in the middle of the front row. And the second of the two lectures that I gave on that occasion was entitled Human Evolution and Human Identity. You've got before you the very first slide that I used on that occasion. Now, that was not my choice of topic. It was the one that I was given. So I gave a fairly standard science talk on the topic, but also highlighting that the whole evolutionary process, right from the beginning, is just one part of God's good creation. And at the end, the Vice Chancellor came up to me and said how much he'd enjoyed the lecture, and then said, but I have one question for you. in the Quran, in Surah 40, it says that man was created from dust. What do you think that means? Well, this was clearly a moment for a careful reply. So I just highlighted the fact that I'm not an expert on Quranic interpretation, which is certainly the case, but then went on to say that I have some good Muslim friends who are well-known commentators on the text. And I noticed that many of them would interpret such Quranic passages in a figurative and theological way, not as relating to modern science as some do think. Unfortunately, the Vice-Chancellor seemed to accept this particular hermeneutical approach to the text. But again, I think this brings up the question as to what is understood by science in different cultures and in different languages and so forth. And how do we relate that understanding of science to the natural sciences? And I think what is interesting is that in those parts of the world where the monotheistic faiths are dominant, it is the creation of humankind and questions about Adam and Eve that raise the most concerns when teaching evolution. And in my experience with Muslim cultures, there's no concern about the age of the earth or about plant and animal evolution, but the reaction comes when one starts talking about the gradual evolutionary origins of humans. And of course, one often finds similar concerns in many Christian environments in North America and elsewhere. And in Muslim environments, of course, there's an extra layer of complexity here due to the current popularity of ijaz in the Muslim world, the claim that many of the recent discoveries of the natural sciences were first described in the Quran. Now, there's a third point that comes out of Michael's talk that I'd just like to highlight. These are three very quite different points, but they are actually related underneath, I think. But clearly there are different views as to whether or not it is wise for a biology teacher, for example, to even mention, let alone discuss, the bigger questions raised by evolution in the environment of a school classroom. But irrespective of the answer to that question, Michael asks whether we want a science education that maximizes conceptual understanding of evolution. And as he said, and as I certainly agree as a biologist, I want to say that the answer to that question is definitely yes. And in those religious contexts where there might be concerns about evolution, I think one key is to focus on clear conceptual understandings, as Michael has already been underlining for us, which at the very same time can be a way of teaching evolution in a way that will appear less threatening to those school pupils present in the classroom who have religious beliefs. And I just want to give you one example of what I mean here. As Michael has already mentioned, the idea that evolution is somehow a chance or random process without direction often becomes embedded in young minds very early on in their education. And I think one reason for that, as Michael was saying, is the way that evolution is taught. They might teach it that step one in the process are these random mutations in the DNA that make differences in the offspring, and then step two, you have natural selection. But immediately by using the word random, a very sort of negative thought has already been sown in young minds that evolution is a rather directionless and random process. And of course, biologists, as you know, use the word random simply to refer to the fact that these changes in the DNA sequence are taking place without any reference to the well-being or otherwise of the organism in question. But it turns out, in fact, that from a mathematical perspective, mutations are not random. Well, an example, here's what happens if you expose yeast to a mutagen that increases the number of mutations in the DNA. And as you can see, the mutations are far from random, but instead are often clustered in particular locations in the DNA. In fact, out of an average 45 new mutations, in this particular experiment was a cluster of 26 mutations in one particular region of chromosome 2. You can see them clustered there on the right hand of your screen, whereas only 19 mutations were found in the whole of the rest of the genome. Take an example from humans. If mutations in the 3.2 billion nucleotides, those genetic letters that make up our own human DNA, which would be random, then they would be equally likely to occur at any position, but that's not the case. This is a recent Dutch study where they sequence 250 family trios, mother, father, offspring, and given that an average 38 new mutations appeared in the newborn that were not there in the parents, if the mutations were randomly distributed throughout the genome, then on average, there should be some sizable gaps between them. In fact, they should be separated by a median of around 84 million nucleotides. But they're not. For example, the researchers found that there were 78 instances in which there were clusters of 2 to 3 mutations found within 20,000 nucleotides of each other, which is a very much smaller number than 84 million. I'm not suggesting you might want to give these examples in the classroom, depends on what class it is, but it just makes the point. Evolution is not actually a chance process at all, certainly not a random one. And so here you have Richard Dawkins, no great lover of religion, I think we have to say, but saying that one of the reasons that he wrote his best-selling book, The Blind Watchmaker, was to destroy this eagerly believed myth that Darwinism is a theory of chance. So the point I really want to make here is that good education clearly involves accuracy in explaining the science. And then as one achieves accuracy, in this case by just explaining the use of the word chance in describing evolution, then I think one finds that many of the sort of worries, not all of the worries, but many of the worries that religious students in the class may simply be removed. It's no longer seen as a threat. So my time is up, 15 minutes. There's my 3 points by way of commentary. First, hovering over this whole discussion is the big question, what do we actually mean by science? Second, what religious texts mean when they speak of the creation of humanity is a closely linked question. And third, teaching evolution, I suggest, in an up-to-date and accurate way will really help to make the way easier for understanding that it's really no threat to religious and cultural convictions. And just to highlight a final point, that is, we have in the Faraday Institute been publishing around 18 different books on science religion for children, aged 2 to 12 over the past couple of years, and I put a few of them up there. And the whole aim of these books is to present religion-friendly books for children, but presented within an evolutionary worldview. And so children actually become used to thinking about dinosaurs. Wonderful book on dinosaurs there. Thinking about dinosaurs within the context of evolution, but seeing it as no threat to their own religious faith. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.
So what I hope to do is point out the 2 main arguments I gathered from Michael's talk. One, and present it in a very simple way for a philosopher to understand. So it's two deductive arguments, okay? And then see what kind of problems I can raise against these arguments and what kind of answers could be given to these problems, okay? So first an epistemic argument, but it's not only epistemic, it has moral aspects or at least normative aspects to it. So if we agree that science is fallible and it advances mainly through criticism of knowledge and knowledgeable others, I took that from some of Michael's papers before, but I think you still agree with that?
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Okay. So if we assume that, okay, and we assume that for advancing society and science, and we assume this is something that science teachers want to do, okay, so for advancing society and science, then should actually help everyone to learn and understand core scientific theories, but they're not supposed to dictate to others what to think about such theories, since, as we said, science advances through criticism. Okay, so I need to understand it. I don't need to tell you what to think about it. Evolutionary theory is a core scientific theory, and so Therefore, teachers should indeed educate everyone to understand evolutionary theory, yet teachers should not teach everyone to accept it as true. And at least, so this is one, I think, very strong epistemic argument why we should, what teachers should and should not do. Okay, and another one is a pragmatic one. Pragmatism is a serious philosophical tradition, and given even what my previous talkers have so beautifully said, I don't even see an important or crucial distinction between mathematics and history and evolution, because given this tradition of pragmatism, Peirce, which was a mathematician, said truth is what works. And in pragmatism, when you say about something that it is true or it is valid, it is, your statement is context sensitive and context dependent, even in mathematics. So I would even offer a more extreme version of what Michael said before. So if we agree on this pragmatic worldview, okay, it also has some moral aspects, or at least normative ones. Now, if we agree that our core beliefs are to a large extent robustly determined by our identity, and I'll have something more to say about identity later. But if we agree that a lot of what I believe come from the fact that I am a Jewish, Israeli, Ashkenazi kibbutznik, it is not by chance that thinking about evolution comes easy to me, and that cooperation seems to me not a difficult idea to accept, or altruism. Okay, so if we accept that, and I think there's enough sociological and psychological research that can validate this premises. If we agree with that premises, and we agree that one's belief about evolution are likewise situated, I'm thinking about Donna Haraway's situated knowledge. If we agree that our beliefs about evolution are situated in, or at least partly situated also in our identity, okay, then religious identity faces severe challenges by current, and we accept that, okay, that religious identity faces severe challenges by current evolutionary theory. We don't set that aside. We don't assume that, oh, it's not a real difficulty. They just didn't understand something. We'll teach them, and then their problems will go away. It's also, if we accept that it's a matter of identity, and that certain religious identities, not all, have a severe problem with evolution, then we take this challenge as a serious challenge. Okay? If we agree to that, therefore, pragmatically speaking, it is not worthwhile to aim for a uniform set of accepted belief about evolutionary theory among people with very different identities. It even sounds strange. Why would we accept people with so different identities to easily agree on such a core idea as evolution? Okay, so these are the two, and I hope I'm not, okay? So these are, I think, two strong arguments, epistemic and pragmatic. Now, what can I say against them? Okay, I mean that's my job, right? Okay, so I don't have time for both. So I'll start with one, and I think, okay, so given, and one last thing, given a pragmatic, that's another consequences. So given, if we agree on a pragmatic moral worldview, teachers even should not aim for context-free acceptance of evolutionary theory. When they enter the class, it is very relevant who they're talking to. And thinking that okay, so I think it's clear. Okay, so problem one. And since the 20, and I think it was, there's a really beautiful book called The Philosophical Breakfast Club, describing the history of when did this 19th century image of the scientist emerge, when and how. Okay, and I recommend it to everyone. So if we agree with that picture, that it began in the mid-19th century, but since the 20th century, science advances via criticism, not by everyone. It only advances by criticism of experts. And it advances and it requires and it solicitates, okay, trust and agreement by the general public. That trust and agreement by the general public is transformed into state funding, which became historically crucial, especially given the world wars and the Second World War in the 20th century. Okay, so philanthropy, okay, never mind, that's history. We won't get there. So if we agree to that historical claim, given that today the state funds most of the research at basic science, we have pharma companies for applied science, but basic science depends on the state. And given that evolution is a basic scientific field, then what we have is if you don't even aim for acceptance of evolution, okay, not aiming for that is expected to reduce public agreement over evolution. I think we see reduced public agreement over evolution. And it may derive from the fact that you don't even aim, or if you, let's say this, if you don't even aim for acceptance, it won't be a surprise that acceptance rate would be reduced. And if that happens, we're expected to reduce the funding of evolutionary theory, our evolutionary research. And thus, given what Dobzhansky said about how everything in biology depends upon evolution, then it would hamper advancement in all of life sciences. Okay, this might look pragmatically very serious problem. Okay, so one possible answer to that problem, because I really like what you tried to do. Okay, so we can argue about a lot of small things in what every one of us says, but I think what you're trying to do is important. So let's think of one possible answer to that problem. And it is that it's not necessarily true that not aiming for theory acceptance is likely to reduce its acceptance, okay? Actually, it could be the other way around. So at least for some communities, and there's much research about how in the global south and for lower socioeconomical levels, or for people holding a peripheral identity, for these groups, which are in many areas, large groups, we can expect a contrary move. That is, communities approached with an effort to convince them, okay, might actually show a higher level of distrust. And members of such communities are very keen, and that I know from other projects I'm doing, they're very sensitive, okay, to feel when someone is trying to convince them in something. And they might feel that their core beliefs and their children's beliefs and identities are under an attack of persuasion. And the person trying to persuade them comes from the hegemonic group. And it's not even personal. They feel that attack wherever they go. All around, they're considered weird, maybe irrational, maybe just ignorant, okay? But there is some problem with them, okay? And if it's sometimes it's a direct persuasion, and sometimes that's the worst case. The feeling is that this is a manipulative move, No. I will talk nicely to you, and hopefully by the end, you'll agree. So I won't talk about that from the start. I'll just do something really nice, maybe have a picnic, show you some bones. And then at the end of the day, I'll measure your rate of acceptance, and I hope it will go higher. And people, especially for minority groups, they are highly sensitive to identifying these kinds of moves. And obviously, they don't like it. Okay? So, not always, but for some groups, often the groups targeted, aiming for theory acceptance explicitly or implicitly can reduce it. And we see in a lot of sociological surveys that the rate of distrust in science is especially rising in marginalized communities. Okay? And the rate of discussing how can we get them on board with evolution is ever growing within the hegemonic community. Okay? So, okay. I don't have time for that, right? Talking to a priest is one way to move forward. And one of the things we tried to do is build courses about evolution that are not an import of academic experts. So what we try to do in several communities so I come from the Upper Galilee, it's a mile from Lebanon, and where I live, it's mostly a conservative, or close to where I live, it's mostly a conservative, most of the people who live there come from conservative or Orthodox groups. And what we try to do is to build a course that combines local and academic experts. And we tried, and we actually asked people, do you want to study about evolution? And it's not schools. And they said to us, yes, we do, because what the experience, one of the elderly women told us, my daily experience is a conflict between who I am and what I should believe. And I don't want this conflict. And we did a course in a conservative religious neighborhood in Kiryat Shmona, combining together 3 different lecturers, one of them an Orthodox, not ultra-Orthodox. In Hebrew, it's called Chardali. So a very big black yarmulke. And it's a more extreme version of naked. One person was highly religious and thought that Darwin had some nice thoughts and that Rab Kook actually agreed, but Darwin also had some mistakes. And we had 2 evolutionary experts who disagreed among themselves. So we had not a monolithic picture of what is evolution. We didn't come to teach people what is evolution. We showed a range of views about evolution. And most important, we asked people, how are these ideas relevant to your life? Relevant to the kinds of dilemmas that you meet every day. And at the end, we didn't check if they believe in evolution more or less, but the feeling was very, very different. So I don't have a general answer about what to do, but I have a general saying about the value of partnership and of cooperation and of aiming for a dialogue over evolution rather than transforming knowledge about evolution. That's it.
Well, that's a great start, really a great start to this conference and to the work that we've been doing into the kind of dialogical conversation we're trying to promote here in Israel. So thank you to our speakers. And we don't have a long time, as long as we had planned for conversation, but we can take a few minutes and a little bit late before we go over for lunch, I think. And the floor is open for thoughts, comments, suggestions, questions. whatever you'd like to say.
Maybe people from home.
Yeah, also people from home.
They see that you don't have to.
Well, if somebody wants to speak up. Who'd like to start? Michael.
I'll jump in. Thank you. 3 great presentations. I enjoyed the last speaker's distinction between the pragmatic argument and the epistemic argument. I agree completely that the pragmatic argument has a lot going for it. I didn't agree that the epistemic argument has so much going for it. It seems to me that on epistemic grounds, we really ought to promote acceptance of belief in evolution, simply because we're not really helping children, and I'm talking about education in schools now, we're not really helping young people see, understand the strength of the evidential base for evolution if we don't also help them see that that strongly implies, I would say conclusively implies, that they ought to believe in evolution. So I think on epistemic grounds, the case for promoting acceptance of the theory of evolution is extremely strong. I also accept that on pragmatic grounds, that it may not be such a smart idea. I suppose that's a comment, not a question.
I'm just gonna build on that a little bit. I actually like the distinction. Both you could already hear from the remarks to begin with, but I'm going to sort of, for the sake of argument, follow through a little bit on this in the following sense. The presupposition is that understanding is an epistemic category that's somehow different from knowledge. That is to say, understanding, you can understand something without accepting or believing it. Whereas the standard account of knowledge, I mean, there are other accounts of knowledge floating around now that are actually very interesting, but the standard account of knowledge since Plato is that knowledge is a subcategory of belief. The knowledge is true belief or justified true belief or some kind of belief, but you can't know something if you don't believe it. So to teach kids to know evolution without believing it would be a conceptually hard thing to do. So in a way, to build a little bit on Michael's argument, the question is understanding really that different? Is understanding evolution really that different from knowing that the theory of evolution is true? Can you genuinely understand it if you don't accept it? Yeah. And I think that problem, which is not a trivial problem, contributes to the suspicion that Ayelet talked about, I think, beautifully, among those who have religious beliefs, who think that it's a bit of a put on when you're coming in and actually, we're just going to teach and understand it, but we don't actually expect your kids to believe it. And they come back and say, nah, we've been down that route before. We know where that heads. And we don't want them to go down that route, so we're just going to not open the door altogether. So, although most of the people that say that are not philosophers, but their intuition is philosophical in that sense, that understanding and knowledge, can they be so distinguished? That's sort of the question. So, yeah, Nitma, please.
I'd like to add something about the promoting of the acceptance, because I feel there is something missing there, because we ignore the creation movements. We ignore the rejection to the theory. It's not like accepting something or a law of physics. It's about something that we are dealing with a huge rejecting for this.
Yeah, Michael, please.
Janet.
Is there somebody here?
Janet, sorry.
Janet, please.
Hi everyone. Sorry to be still in England, having this conversation very remotely. I think I agree with Michael, and I think I was struck by when you're talking, Hanan, I think it's more complicated than that still. And for me, it's about the perceived, the claim that the teacher can be neutral when they're promoting understanding, and makes complete sense on one level, as Michael said, that what we're talking about is promoting understanding, not acceptance. But how far that implies a neutrality on the part of the teacher, and that pure understanding with no sense of true belief, truth claims, being part of the conversation. And I'm just not sure it's quite as simple as that to strip it out. And I think that's part of the sensitivity and the complexity. So I don't know if that's a question or an observation, but that's what I was provoked to think.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Well, Michael, we'll let you get back here. We can let him jump in. A bunch of other people jumped in first. Yes, here you go, please.
I think this is a very interesting question. And one way through to sort of respond to all the different elements is to say, why not actually look at things like the evolution of belief itself? Agustin Fuentes is an evolutionary anthropologist who wrote a book that came out of the Gifford lectures a few years ago called Why We Believe. And that is actually a very interesting exploration of, from his point of view at least, of how it is that certain commitments have come in our own evolutionary history. So what's interesting though is that he also talks about belief in science in that tapestry, if you will. So if people understand something a little bit more about both the biological history of science, but also the history of science, then some of the claims made by science could then perhaps be more qualified. So in other words, the way science is taught, it is taught in such a way that this is the knowledge within which we need to inculcate ourselves. That's different from actually understanding something about its history and even some of the explanations that scientists are trying to use. But when the torch is then turned on their own science as also having an evolutionary story, that sort of, if you like, qualifies some of those claims, as well as that, so it opens up this idea that science is a much more contested and debated topic rather than seeing some sort of fixed understanding that we need to accept in toto. So I think that may possibly make it a little bit more palatable to some other groups. I'm also aware with some of the work that we do with Indigenous communities that there is a fair bit of hostility towards westernized knowledge, part of the reason being because of the colonial aspects of that. And I think the mistrust in science is now beginning to catch on, not just within those groups in the global south, but also in other places as well. So I think understanding what is around those areas of mistrust is also important in science education, because the culture in which school children are now situated is one not of complete acceptance of science as it was maybe 50 years ago, but one where there's much less trust in what science may have to say. So I'm sorry, it's a slightly complex answer, but I'm just trying to raise a few issues on the table.
Yes, Tali, please.
So I have an issue with the use of the term belief. Let's talk about cell theory or particular nature of matter, for example. We are never asked to believe, okay? We asked to understand the particular nature of matter, because then we can use our understanding to explain bonding, for example. Or we are asked to use our understanding of the cell theory to explain other mechanisms in organisms' bodies. I think that avoiding the belief term it is a key to help students understand evolution and use it to explain, to understand other processes in nature. And I think that both in Hebrew and also in English, the term belief really complicates things. So, and we never ask if we accept the cell theory, right? We are asked to understand it. We're never asked if we accept the particular nature of matter, although kids at certain age do not understand that this solid table is built out of particles, right? But once they understand it in various ways, they can use this knowledge to explain other processes in chemistry.
Well, I have something to say about that, but Ayelet and Michael wanted to get in, and maybe that would be a good way for us to round things out in the conversation. Well,
I'll try and respond to a number of people. I'm hoping that when Janet said she agreed with Michael, she meant Michael Reiss. Because although Michael Hand and I agree on a very large number of things, we have managed to find one particular issue about which we disagree intellectually that we've now carried through a number of different topics. But more seriously, can I say, first of all, I thought that what Ayelet said was just absolutely wonderful, because it both seemed philosophically rigorous in a way that Michael had helped to build on a tiny bit, but also ended up with the sort of learning communities that I suspect many of us who do work in education would like to see, where people are able to explore, to think, whereas you said they don't feel, this thing's up with seniors, point about colonialism, where they don't feel pushed in a direction. And as I admit, I only hinted at this in what I said, but one of the rather nice ironies is that it's precisely those situations where people don't feel pushed in a direction they think they might not want to go, where they are in fact most likely to learn well. It's not a large literature, but there is this literature about attempts to teach evolution in a non-directed way. In other words, not for overt acceptance. And it's not, as I say, large, it's not incredibly robust, but it suggests to me, as I think I'm hearing from you as well, that it might be a teaching which actually leads to more people accepting it than the conventional. Now, of course, as Tali and I know, the reasons why you and I don't worry too much about terminology when we're teaching cell theory or a particular theory of matter is precisely because that's not contentious to many people. And it's only in these sort of areas that it's probably worth using the careful distinctions that Michael Hanan and other people here are trying to make. And the last couple of points I'd like to make, Hanan, I mean, you know, you've worked for decades in these areas, but surely just on an everyday level. When I mean, think of standard history teaching in my country would include for almost all children before the age of 16, trying to understand the rise of Nazism. You want children to understand that in everyday English. To state the absolute obvious, you do not want them to accept the arguments, the fallacious, erroneous, disgraceful, etc. arguments that were used. So it's certainly for ordinary school teachers, they're pretty clear, however much, and this is me now teasing, however much some philosophers may find acceptance and understanding very close, they're pretty good about separating the two, to be honest. And that's true in general when we teach any sort of controversial issues in science, by which I just mean the ordinary sense, like, you know, should you introduce wolves to Yellowstone Park? You talk them through the advantages of introducing wolves, try and get them to see that side of the argument, understand it. You talk them through the other, try and get them to understand it. And then, roughly speaking, it's up to them whether they accept introducing wolves to Yellowstone Park is a good thing or not.
Yeah, please.
So I'm very thankful for your criticism. I think it was a strong blow. and then you added to it. So I think it was my fault of not being clear enough of what do I mean by a dialogue. So if I have a partner with a dialogue, first thing is dialogue does not come with neutrality. So I also have an identity. And yes, I believe in this, believe in the sense of ha'amana, lo emunah. When you translate to Hebrew, it becomes much more neutral, belief as ha'amana. But so one of the things is that I say, I was one of the 3 teachers there in that course. And so it was important for me to state up front what I accept or what I believe in. It's part of an honest dialogue, but it can only happen if I truly care and listen and try to learn from someone holding a different identity and a different view about these data and a different interpretation of it. And so from an epistemic point of view, I agree. I say, look, I think, right, that this theory is the best theory we have. I know that there's many, and I'm partaking in criticizing this theory. I'm part of this community of critical knowers that try to criticize evolution. And it's important for me that you would know that I believe in this and I want you to accept it. I want you to accept it. But it's also important for me to know that you would see the faults and the problems with this, and you would use it at the way that is relevant to you. And I think in that sense, I can be a non-neutral and true partner to this dialogue and kind of solicit criticism and still be honest about the fact that, yes, I want you to accept it.
So I think we have to draw things to a close. Just for all honesty, I do think there are forms of understanding that don't require acceptance. I think understanding is a layered concept, and there are different kinds of understanding. And part of what we need to do in this project is actually tease out the sort of kind of understanding we're talking about. But that's stuff that we'll have to play out later because we don't have to talk about it later. Let's thank all of the participants for